Sabelo Skiti, multi-award winning investigative journalist. Thank you so very much for joining us on the CheckPoint podcast. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I feel very privileged to finally be on this podcast.
Your work, right, is the reason why you're here. You do a splendid job. You always have done so. And I'm sure many South Africans have followed your career and the many stories that you've exposed. Important information that you have shared with the nation, you know? And you're here today to talk about the work that you and your colleagues Sandu Jiga and Sipho Masondo did on really digging into what has become known as the Big Five cartel, right? And through your series of articles, I think you started them like in March somewhere.
Yes,
right?
about late Feb, early March, yeah.
Yeah, and then into April as well. You really took South Africans into very scary worlds. Number one, the world of some of South Africa's most dangerous criminals, the world of some of the most dangerous policemen who seem to be committed to defeating the ends of justice. But you also exposed us to a side of the police that is not often spoken about.
Yeah.
The good cop.
Yes.
The good detective. Right?
And
is
the
that
work,
how you felt?
And the work that goes into it.
Yeah.
You know, I think for us, from the beginning, you know, when we sort of started getting into this project, it was something that we, you know, over the last couple of months, sort of looking, you know, I can take you back to how at the Madlanga Commission, you know, these cell phone records were being brought out, these WhatsApps, you know, surprising these guys with their own communications, you know, and their own sort of carelessness. And I think for us, it was such me particularly, because I've always been a bit of a buff for this sort of stuff, you know, the sleuthing, the investigations, how things get cracked. And I think for a lot of South Africans, you know, typically you and I, our interface with crime is, say, maybe someone breaks into your house, maybe someone, you know, breaks into your vehicle, steals your car. And a lot of the times, within days of opening a case, you get a call from an IO telling you that it's now undetected. We are closing this case. If you come across your laptop and you know your serial number, please call me and I will follow it up, type of thing. So
the
that
investigating officer, that is, yeah.
Yeah, so that builds that sort of belief, you know, that you know, our police are not that very good. And if you think about it, I mean, if it's those type of crimes, the only thing that will help them is if they know that there's a syndicate in a particular area, or if there's fingerprints. So there's very little that a criminal has to do to sort of mask and cover what has happened, particularly if you don't have CCTV footage and all of those things in your house. What for me was quite interesting here was that we got to then see the other side of the police, you know, the intelligence driven side, that is always sort of like opaque. You don't know how these guys, you know, get that nugget, what information comes forth from where. You know, it was very interesting to me. Also, I mean, I don't know, a lot of people don't actually track the development of detection and the police in South Africa. You know, you would remember that at a time, you know, during the apartheid era, there was a reliance on what we call human. So that's like intelligence based on people that are already inside. You know, they always had to plant spies, plant people in organizations and networks. Yes, you know. So that's what, you know, South Africa's you know, intelligence community basically back then was known for. And what we forget is that there was a time when our law enforcement agencies was working, particularly, you know, just after democracy, a lot with, you know, Western organizations that had already built up databases of DNA, had already built up, you know, databases of, you know, DNA, things like fingerprints and all of those things. We got those techniques, you know, and we got access to the technology that allows you, you know, to begin to track people's movements, you know, to begin to track what is happening with the devices. You know, I think we interacted with it only, I remember the first sort of big case was just before the NASREC conference, when, you know, journalists started writing about the grabber.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That's when we began to understand that, oh, actually police have got systems where They can actually get into people's devices. And of course, that was always within a limited range, right? But it was something that, for a lot of people rocked their world. If you go into how these kidnappings, for instance, are getting solved, you'll be so fascinated that a simple proof of payment, for instance, with just a little bit of code inside that is sent to the would-be criminal or the kidnapper. And the moment they open that, then it allows the police and law enforcement to sort of gain access to information that's on the device. Now they can actually track where this person is moving, but more importantly, who they're talking to, so that you can begin to get a wider, look at the network. So for us, just going back to, the Madlanga thing now, for us, that was the fascinating thing we wanted to tell, was to sort of look and see, how are these guys doing? General Mkwanazi at the ad hoc sort of gave a little bit of insight when he said, you think you can delete your WhatsApp? We can bring back even the deleted, the viewed ones, and all of those things. So we needed to see, how common is that, firstly, in these sort of high stakes investigations, and then most importantly, who are the people that actually do it?
Yeah, and I think your articles say two very important things. One, that there is capacity within the police service, and also that crime doesn't always pay, as many people believe, right?
An important message for particularly our society. If you look at the amount of evidence, again, that is brought out, you realize that a lot of these thugs, I think for lack of a better word, were so brazen. Again, that they were very careless with, how they were communicating with each other, and how, money was moving between them. And I think a big part of that is goes to the first part of your statement, where it wasn't so much for them a belief that, police don't have the capacity, but they knew that they've compromised the right sort of police in the right sort of positions to either thwart investigations or allow investigations to run the full course and then just sit on them, where nothing then happens from what they've picked up.
They were brazen because they were protected.
Yes,
they were
knew.
confident in their protection.
Yeah, they knew. And if you think about it, that network was when it starts unraveling, then you begin to think that this is not the image I had of who are the people that are basically involved in high level criminality in this country, and I'm talking about even high level procurement in the state. These are people that don't attend political rallies. We always thought that it was only the politicians and those close to them that are actually directing the flows of procurement money and, how money gets siphoned out. But some of these people are regular Joes, in the taxi industry, that you would just think that are maybe occupying a certain corner, leveraging whatever little influence they have, to sort of push legislation to keep themselves protected. But actually, these guys were now even directing procurement.
And another thing that came from the stories that you've written, and we'll go specifically to some of them, is crime is a business, and it funds other legal businesses as well.
Yes. Some of these names that we've heard being mentioned are people that in some circles are considered respectable or respected, But again, because they know that they've got the right people sitting on the right information and not exposing who they are, they can then take these funds, funnel them into the economy, and in the end, it just looks like regular old wealth.
Yeah, so it's like money laundering, basically cleaning the money. So let's start with this one that you wrote back in March. That the headline was "Inside Cat Taxi Wars: Assassination Plot Exposes Big Five Cartel Succession Battle."
Yeah.
This was fine police work. I mean, you go into the attempted murder of taxi boss Josie Banyoni. Just briefly summarize what you found.
For us there, it was so fascinating how, for all intents and purposes, this would have been considered an attempted hit outside an estate in Centurion.
Another murder in bloody South Africa.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And one where, the shooters or the would-be killers got away within 2 minutes. But then detectives that go onto that scene are people that are so meticulous that the pieces that they recover, firstly, it's like, they log them so properly in terms of that investigation, and they don't stop looking They go through CCTV footage on the freeway, tracking the vehicle from when it leaves to ultimately to when the vehicle is last seen. And then they also track the numbers that were around the area at that time. And in no time, they begin to see that these numbers were communicating to each other just hours before.
And these are
These are the
Mabusela and Musekeka.
Yes, those two gentlemen. Their communication and their locations are tracked to a point where they know exactly when one of them actually tagged on to Joe Sibanyoni as he was moving about his day earlier. This is more than 8 hours earlier. He just went to a dealership, picked up a vehicle, then went to one of probably the most public places in Bryanston, Nickelway Center. He sits there for hours with his friends. They are in the parking lot at different locations, communicating with each other at all times. And then they follow the vehicle, ultimately. And again, this is the police work that tracks. It tracks the vehicles as they move through the north of Joburg all the way to Centurion. Ultimately,
and on the highway as well. They track,
and for me, this is the beauty of it, is that these are detectives that realize that, okay, we've got, the gantries on the freeway, we've got CCTV in the areas, we can actually follow this car and track it. So they're not just relying on the cell phone, but they're also then relying on the visuals of the vehicle as it is moving through the city, following. And now they can also see that it's within proximity of Sibanyoni's car to show that he's being tailed till you get to the shooting. And for me, the most brilliant part of the sleuthing is how, because you track the vehicle and you track the cell phone, you knew where the vehicle stopped for a number of hours before it was moved again in the morning, presumably when, the block was no longer hot, as the young people would say. Then when they get to that house, they then realize that the owner actually has a link to another suspect in another case, but who is now at that time already linked to these gentlemen. And he just requires that this car be housed overnight. And then suddenly, it gives them Cat Matlala. He makes the request that the car is coming, two gentlemen come, drop the car off, they leave. The next day, before the vehicle is picked up, he calls again and he says, thank you for keeping this car for me overnight. Now two guys are going to come and fetch it. And then the most, again, brilliant detective work. This car is found after it had been missing for longer than a year. And now it had changed hands 2 times. Because immediately after the hit, and I think for me this is so instrumental, is that one of the things that the police then learn from the person who bought the car initially, a couple of days after this crime has taken place, tells them that the person who had brought the car to him, which is Mabusela, informed him that he was supposed to destroy the vehicle. But he couldn't stand to destroy that vehicle. He needed to make a bit of money.
More money.
Yes. So they then sell the car. This gentleman tries to have it fixed, then sells it on to a dealership. The dealership then sells it on to another unsuspecting, individual in South Africa, who then eventually has to now give this car over to the police. Police went to his house on a random Monday evening, and then told him that this car has been linked to criminality and it's part of an investigation. And, the detection work doesn't end there. When they actually strip the car, the color is different. The car has been...
It was initially white,
It was initially white. Now the car has been wrapped in a fancy green color. It's got a new set of rims. But as soon as they sort of peel off that wrap, they begin to see what looks like bullet indentations in the vehicle from where it had been shot at by the guard at the estate. Then when they take the car apart, they are then able to actually retrieve shell casings of the weapons that were actually fired at Joe Sibanyoni. You know what I mean? That sort of detective work is not work that gets done firstly overnight and gets done by someone who doesn't have the requisite experience and, more importantly, the capacity to be able to harness, because it's good old-fashioned detective work, but then also on the other hand, it's the appreciation of what the technology can do for you, in aiding you to sort of track the vehicle. And one of the key pieces of evidence in that case is a cover of a headlight that during the shooting had come off the white BMW, left on the scene, picked up and stored by the police. Because when they recovered the car more than a year later, that mirror was still damaged, and they could literally match, that mirror cover to that vehicle.
That's also meticulous evidence gathering. I
Yeah.
mean, every single piece of evidence is important in these cases.
Yeah. It shows you that these things can happen. The police can do these things. Maybe the police will probably say to you that we just don't have enough detectives who can do this. But certainly that sort of capacity is there. I think it's been a fascinating tale for us, because it gets you into the mind, of like an investigator, when you walk onto a scene.
Yes.
What is it that you are supposed to be looking for, and where do you think that it's taking you, beyond the stuff that you'll get much later through the CCTV and all of those things, but physically, what sort of evidence looks out of place in a crime scene, what matters, what doesn't, and then in the end, you're able to bring it all together.
And it also speaks to the coordinated work of this team of police members.
And remember, there's things that even beyond sort of what we're discussing here, like things like chain of evidence, how this stuff gets logged in, where it gets kept. In a country where you would remember at some point, the most common refrain was the docket is missing.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
the key evidence, the DNA is gone. We can't
Yeah.
prosecute this rape and all of that.
Yeah.
So that for me is one of those things that show that we actually can do it. And I think it should be a beacon of hope for us. And it should be a warning bell for those would-be criminals that sit and watch the movies and think that these things are simple.
Okay, so there are two characters that actually sort of link all of these big five cases, it appears, outside of Kat Matlala and Katie Molefe. Tiego Mabusela and Musakegana.
Yeah.
These two seem to be high-profile hitmen for the
Guns for
big
hire.
five.
Yeah. Well,
and you say they belong to a gang, so there's more of them.
Yes. And I think the most interesting thing to us, right, looking at the big five, is remember, part of the big five are people that are involved in the taxi industry. And now that in the taxi industry, guns for hire is a very commonplace thing.
Has always been there.
Yes.
I mean, the whole term of Inkabi.
These are guys that fight wars. They have, number one, access to an incredible amount of arms, and they have access also to people who don't mind, getting their hands dirty. So that already is a recipe for something else. But then what was curious about the big five is that then it wasn't just the taxi people. It brought in these other characters, these underworld guys, the likes of Kat Matlala, Katie Molefe. These are people that know struggle. They've risen up literally from the streets. I mean, if you recall Kat's story when he was speaking about how he came up in Pretoria, these are guys that literally come from the streets. And I think this is partly where, things sort of come apart for the big five in a sense. If you look at, that murder of Arman Swat, you look at the amounts that were involved there. I think that tender was worth about 1.2 or 1.6 million. Now, considering who these people are, I don't for 1 minute imagine that a Mswati, for instance, or a Joe Sebanyoni would have really taken umbrage about someone blowing the whistle on a 1.2 or 1.6 million tender. They probably would have just let it slide. But it's their involvement now in the other parts where you see that, but these ones are the ones that took umbrage and they decided that this person had to be eliminated. And that ultimately is what then led to all of the stuff unraveling, because once they get picked up and those guns get recovered as part of that investigation, then police are able to link them to many more killings that looked random in some cases, dating back to 2022. Other attempted murders and all of that.
So these two characters are, if I can just sum this up so that people understand what we're talking about here, Tiego Mabusela and Musakegana, have been charged with the attempted murder of Joe Ferrari Sibanyoni. You just told us about that attempted murder just now. DJ Vetis, and Tebogo Tobejani, who's Matlala's ex-girlfriend. They're also co-accused in the Katie Molefe case for the murders of DJ Somebody, DJ Vintos, Ahmad Swart, who was a mistaken identity situation there.
This is again where it becomes fascinating, is that part of what the cops then collect, particularly in WhatsApp conversations between these two gentlemen. You see how to them it was almost like waking up every day and going to work. You know what I mean? You're chasing targets. When you look at the discussions between the two of them, because in some of them you see that it's 10 in the morning, and then one of them will say to the other, "Hey, I'm hungry. Does this guy not have any work for us?" Because for them this is now it's their living, and for them clearly again you can see that they take it very lightly.
Yeah, and how they talk about how much they're going to charge, and if it's just the two of us, we're going to make more, etc. It really is shocking and disturbing.
And if you think about it, for me, it's just thinking further. These are people that at any given point were moving with at least an AK-47 in the vehicle and more guns. So if these people, heaven forbid, had gotten into like an altercation or a road rage incident, these are people who've got no qualms about taking a life, and they have these arms in a vehicle, broad daylight, traveling, ready to use. It sort of jars you to the reality of the country that we're in. I know sometimes that we sort of get lulled, especially when you go about your daily grind. You imagine that if you look at a storefront, that's all there is to it. The guy driving next to you is just like you going to pick up his kid or he's going to work. But these are people that are doing all of these things in broad daylight.
And then let's move over to the Bushokha case, which is really, really heartbreaking. Because there was good detective work, but you tell us the story. Of course, the investigation was basically stopped.
Yeah. And again, at what point does this investigation get stopped? I
This
think
is Jerusha. Let me just explain. Jerusha, who was kidnapped and is still missing. Yeah.
And of course, I think the important bit is as well is that Jerusha is someone who's known to Kat Matlala. And is someone at some point Kat Matlala had been displeased with because of a debt or whatever that was not paid. And for me, where I like to start this is at the point where there's a raid at Kat Matlala's house. And when the police get access to a certain room, they begin to see key elements. A sheet that was in the ransom video that Bushwaka's family had been given, basically when he had been taken. It was still in that position where if you were to place the camera, you would be able to say that actually this is exactly where, in that room, where this sheet was. I suppose for me, this is why then we should be upset about how the police have been compromised. Because for all intents and purposes, when that information comes out at that particular time, he had been missing for a short time. Does he not get recovered? Now we are sitting here, it's been months. We don't know where he is. It is a tragic, tragic situation. I can't imagine how it is, for his close one and his loved ones on a daily basis. And when they see the sort of, because I don't think it's sloppiness, when they see the intended destruction and thwarting of investigations by policemen who are now shown to have been close to criminals, and in some cases in the pockets of criminals, people who were basically dedicated to being runners for criminals instead of doing their work in the police. It is a sad tale. What has happened to the Boshocha family. And again, for me, it's you get detective work that gets you to the place. And then, the state just sits on it.
Somebody in the state sits on it.
Yeah.
And this time it's alleged that it's General Sibia.
Yeah.
Right. And then Matlala is asked by the ad hoc committee
Talk about
to speak to the mother of Jerusha, his friend. And what does Matlala say on live television?
Jerry's mom is watching. Talk to her.
I will say, Mama, you know very well me and your son, we are very, very, very close friends. We've done a lot of things together, traveled together, me and his wife and my wife. And there was nothing that I will do to harm your son. Actually, your son was like a young brother to me. So there are people who are getting between us, trying to convince you that I took your son so that you might think of me as this boogeyman that people paint me to be. But from the bottom of my heart, I've never and I will never, ever do anything to harm your son or your family.
And how does he continue to deny some of these things? It's going to be very interesting.
No, he certainly can't. I think it's the end of the road for him. I suspect that we will not see Cat Matlala out in the streets.
But there's so many other Cat Matlala because it's very clear that crime is a career.
Mm.
And that you start somewhere. I mean, when we looked at Cat Matlala's rise, if you may call it that, I mean, there was a time when he was arrested for housebreaking and what people would call,
he's a petty criminal.
Yeah.
He's a thug. He's a street thug, basically, who has ascended, again, if we want to, use that sort of descriptors. But for me, one of the things that gives me heart again is the fact that the acting minister of police and the president seem to have taken note of the kind of work that the specialized unit, in this instance, the political killings task team, although some of these cases they got roped in because they were backing up crime intelligence, specifically the Gauteng crime intelligence. And what I like is that almost immediately you've seen the creation of what was initially called the Madlanga task team. I think the justice has asked them to change asked them to change the name.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's heartening for me because now it means that you've got that sort of attention to detail. And again, I think, we mustn't forget that these guys were also responsible for the breakthrough in the assassinations at Fort Hare University. There's other crimes that might not be considered political that they've been able to weigh their expertise and experience on. And what I'm hearing now from police sources is that they are now replicating that. So in no time, you're going to hear of similar units across the country. The focus now is on a Big Five cartel. You've got an issue and a situation that's building in the Eastern Cape around extortion rackets and those syndicates there.
Yeah.
And again, quite curiously for me, is that two prominent taxi bosses, I think one is based in East London and another one is based in, I think it's Matatiele, but I stand to be corrected on that, have also been arrested for, extortion of buses all the way to the Western Cape.
The long distance buses,
where buses get pelted, they get stopped, they get shot at, they get hijacked, and then people go to the owners of the buses and they, demand a certain percentage. And in some cases, they even take over, these companies. So the fact that you're going to have it replicated now means that we will then, for the first time, be in a position to actually get a grip on organized crime, which is a great, great development.
Yeah, it is. Let's move on. I mean, you spoke earlier about taxi bosses and these cartel members. But then there are DJs and entertainers that also come into the mix. And that brings us to the story that you did on the missing drugs, right? I think this is the headline that you had, right?
Yes.
DJs, drug wars, what Kat told me. The story that got you in a little bit of trouble.
I suppose it's a part of why these stories become so important. This is the story of how an innocuous sort of attempted hit on a Pretoria DJ is quite popular. I believe that he also is an owner of a night spot. He's someone that is associated with, the more frivolous sort of things in life. But he had been one of many. Others had been successfully killed. His childhood friend, DJ somebody, died a very lonely death in Woodmead, coming from a gig. They shot at his vehicle more than 40 times with an automatic rifle, killing him. There had been another entertainer shot in the heart of Sandton, and another entertainer, well-known DJ, again shot in Soweto. Again, a lot of bullets coming from high caliber weapons. You can see that these were not people that got into arguments in the middle of a night with drunk people who just emotively shot them. These were people that were being shot to be killed.
These were hits. Yeah.
They were meant to die. If going back to just the statement that was given to police by the Pretoria DJ Vetties.
This is what the article is about.
Yes.
DJ Vetti's affidavit, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
He basically says that he remembers as he's lying on the ground, someone shouting at the people standing over him, pointing guns at him, that Mutube Hloko, basically shoot him in the head, ensure that he's dead. So these were murders. And I think his statement then for us unravels what has happened. Because he takes us into this world, the concept of stokvels. You know them in a community sense. A lot of the times it was stokvels with mothers who wanted to ensure that whatever little they earn can go a long way. A lot of the times it would involve during just before December, there would be a big pile of money saved up to, basically buy groceries that's going to last the holidays into the new year. But you've always had these societies as well, in places like Pretoria, which brought together men, to socialize, whether it was a jazz stokvel on a Sunday afternoon, whether it was a stokvel of people who love soccer, who would sit and, but this stokvel was of a different nature. It brought together people who were all about terrorizing and fleecing the state of money in whichever way they can. It was, taxi bosses, you had people involved in the drug world. And for me, the most interesting thing was that it then also went out of Gauteng with the inclusion of notorious Cape Town underworld figure, Ralph Stanfield. We know that he is associated with so-called extortion and other rings and rackets in the Western Cape, which are similar to, what we're beginning to see unravel in Gauteng as well. So, and then as a part of all of this, because there's a need again to sort of want to flaunt and the DJs are involved. So these stokvels then bring all of these characters together. But then a great betrayal happens. Consignment of drugs belonging to one of the members in the Big Five gets intercepted in KZN. And
By the
again,
police.
by the police.
Yeah.
You're right. This consignment was worth 200 million. The size of that consignment required it to be, and because it's such high value, it needed to be stored in a particular way to secure it. And I think the original thinking was that it was actually could only be stored up in Pretoria. It was going to move and be stored in a more secure environment in Pretoria. But it is taken then for overnight storage to a police station in Port Shepstone that is very poorly guarded. And to make matters worse, on the night, there is load shedding. So which means that there is even no electricity. But for me, the most curious thing is that it's a huge consignment of drugs. It gets stored in a police station where there's a huge cache of automatic rifles and there's other drugs here. But when the consignment goes missing through a break-in, the rifles are left there and everything else that was in that evidence room is left there. Only the consignment of drugs is taken. Now, if you listen to General Mkwanazi, I think speaking generally on media interviews and also at the ad hoc committee, also at the Madlanga, because he also brought this out, because he wanted, I think, us to join the dots about how these drugs were stored carelessly and then were removed. And if you remember, General Sinona, the head of the Hawks in KZN, was tongue-tied when he was asked to explain how that decision came to be made, that these drugs were taken out of a more secure environment, put in a police station, which was basically free for these guys to take. They didn't even have CCTV footage there. or coverage rather. You know,
Didn't they end up in a Hawks office?
that was the
Yeah.
police station, the
Yeah.
Hawks office there,
Yeah.
in that police station.
Yeah.
So
And so they were basically first stolen by the
Yes.
police
yes,
in a way.
yeah. Well, if you think about it, I mean, this gets more interesting, right? Because when these drugs are being moved to Johannesburg, there is another group of police who stop this consignment, including provincial traffic police. They then realize that these are drugs. They take them to a warehouse in Eriton. And as they are calling for backup, another group of policemen show up. And at some point, there's a standoff between two different groups of law enforcement over what to do with these drugs. Eventually, these drugs are then taken. And then these drugs end up basically being sold through nightclubs in Gauteng, basically, which is where it then becomes interesting and brings in the DJs. Because a lot of the DJs that are involved here, including, DJ Somebody, and of course, I must now say that up until now, there's no evidence of his direct involvement, right? Except that he had introduced someone to a member of the cartel unwittingly, who was trying to sell the same batch of drugs, basically. And police know this because apparently that consignment of drugs had a very distinct sort of insignia on them, sort of denoting, the origins of the drugs and all of that. So this is how he then gets pulled in because Ralph Stanfield, who gets introduced to a rapper by the moniker Heavy Pablo, who then tries to sell him these drugs, is immediately aware that there's a consignment that my fellow Stockfell members are missing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
He then informs them.
This is Mswazi's gang.
This is
Yeah.
now Mswazi's Stockfell.
Yeah.
He then informs them that, listen, this young man's friend basically tried to sell these drugs. I believe that these drugs are with them. Then
Trying
you
to
start
sell
seeing,
your drugs, basically, is
to
what
me,
he's saying. Yeah.
yes. So then you start seeing the deaths of these DJs. And the theory had always been that it is drug related. And the use of it is that the nightclubs, I mean, if you remember, if we go back to the early 2000s, right? At the time of there was a lot of shooting in the club scene. Here in Cape Town and in Johannesburg, the individuals, if you remember these names, Cyril Beaker, Yuri the Russian, people like Mickey Schultz and those guys were also said to have been involved. We thought initially that the fight was over just, nightclubs and turf and all of that.
Yeah.
But in essence, it was turf and the ability, which is why it included the security company, the bouncing companies. It was basically the space to operate. Who has access to that market in that nightclub, where people are spending reckless amounts of money trying to get, these drugs for recreational use. So again, it's more or less of the same thing here. And I think this is what brought them all together. Is the nexus is basically money. The DJs afford the Stockfells or cartels a captive market who go to these places wanting to listen to their music. But of course, accompanying the music is then a nice time that involves often alcohol and recreational drugs.
You said to me earlier that none of this would be known had there not been the police infight.
Yeah.
That Mkwanazi basically posed.
Yeah.
If
you think
key.
about it, I mean, and I suppose maybe he wasn't saying it this way, but he did in actual point at, I think it was at the ad hoc committee during one of his appearances, where he just said that what brought it all together for him was not even the minister's decision. He was puzzled by the minister's decision. This is now the decision to disband the political killings task team. But it was when the dockets of active cases, some of which were ready to be actioned on, people to be charged and all of that, are now taken away from the people who had been investigating them and taken to head office without an explanation of what is going to happen to them. This is why he then, and of course, after that, what then happens is that it's the arrest of senior police. This being among them the head of crime intelligence, General Kumalo.
Mm,
You know,
mm.
this is then for him, then convinces him that actually we are in a situation where things are getting out of hand. And remember, at that time, they had already had access to Kat Matlala's phone, so they
Yes.
had began to know the communications that had been taking place and the sort of lobbying that Matlala had been doing for his tender and how he had gotten access to basically the highest office in terms of law enforcement, being the Minister of Police through an advisor. You know, so. But again, it's very telling that it took um, the infighting between police, the arrest of General Kumalo, for it to get to a head where now, General Mkhwanazi finds himself in a position where he feels it's either this or we then surrender this country to the thugs.
Do you think, having done all of this work, that the police service can be cleaned up? I mean, I think people forget that before there was SAPS, there was SAP.
Yeah.
And the South African police were used to commit crimes against humanity.
Mm.
To use some of this brilliant detective work to kill people who were fighting against apartheid.
Yeah.
So, in a way, the police were already contaminated.
And I think we did manage to in those early days, sort of turn, the policing around. I think there was a point where
How?
police
During Fivers' time?
well, just after Fivers,
Because
I think.
Jackie Selebi, his hands were not clean.
At the end.
And then now?
At the end. Ngepile, and I think this is a very interesting thing for me, and I think some work is probably going to go into it at some point. We have people that go into law enforcement, being clean. And then it turns out that they become corrupted. Something about the system. And I think this is hopefully what the Madlanga Commission must uncover for us. Something about the system allows for members of the police to become corrupted. And I think a part of it has to do with, this obsession that South Africans have with a certain type of lifestyle, throwing away an entire career over a 65,000 Rand suit, from the Diamond Walk. It's ludicrous for me that Agliotti thought that buying Italian shoes, for the president would have somehow, covered him. You know what I mean? It's just that for me is a thing that I just battle to understand. But that thing seems to have captured our most senior police. And I mean, if we take all of this stuff out, before this, there had been the fight over slush funds in crime intelligence, the misuse of the funds, how the slush funds were said to, have financed people's, lifestyles again, just this luxury living. It's not for a need or anything. And I think what is happening now is a great first step. And again, South Africa has a lot of times when we have those opportunities, to start over.
Yeah.
Now it's all about, do we then, follow through? You know what I mean? It's about missing. It's about missing those, those moments, those key moments. If you think about the Cyril Ramaphosa story, this was not what it was supposed to look like. When the ANC was telling us, Tuma Mina, and we are going to renew and all of that. That again was a point where the whole world was invested in South Africa turning its fortunes around. Little did we know that we are going to then be in a process where uncovering even more than what was uncovered in his predecessor's time. I mean, if you track someone like Esbia, for instance, this is someone that not too long ago we had been exposing how he, as a member of the Gauteng Hawks then, together with Anwar Ramat, were almost being hounded out of the state, with spurious charges, and in using tactics that now are being associated with him against other police members. And I suppose the question to ask then is that what happened where? How does he then become someone who's now associated with people that you and I would assume he's got a very strong hate for? Suddenly these are people that he's trying to explain why they were found at a party he was hosting. It for me is going to be a fascinating story in the history of South Africa, as an epoch, a moment where um, this country basically came to a realization of the breakdown of law.
From here, how do we move forward? Because, I mean, we must take credit as a country for having the kind of democracy that allows all of this stuff to be ventilated
Yeah.
openly and publicly on
Mm.
live television for everybody to see.
Yeah.
I mean, it
Um,
hasn't, I don't know of any country that's done
No, no, no,
anything
no.
similar.
And I think and I think this is for me one of the things that should bring us hope in South Africa is that by now we know that you might think you've got one up on us. In the end, your shenanigans will always get exposed. It's supposed to be an everyday thing for the bank to call you up and say, "Sorry, Mr. Skiti, we've just seen a payment of 100,000 going into your account. Would you care to explain what that is for?" And I've had this, having winning awards, and then the money comes in, and it's an unfamiliar deposit. The bank will call you and say, "Listen, we've just seen here that I think it was Wits at one point that had paid for us being runners up in one of these investigative journalism awards." And the bank did its due diligence there, and I mean, it was a small amount compared to the hundreds of millions that moves through accounts sometimes. And I don't understand why the banks are not asking these questions often enough.
Of the cat matlalas of this world
Yes.
and people who are I needed to take out this money to pay this bribe
Mm,
and all of that kind
you
of
know,
stuff and houses that are being bought with all of
yeah,
this money. I think the private sector also has a lot to
lot,
answer
yeah.
to.
I'll actually tell you a story, and I mean, I'm not going to go into brands and stuff like that because it was a story I was working on that I just never got to publish. So I was tracking corruption in one of the SOEs. And one of the things that happened is that one of the recipients of the corrupt funds went and bought a particular sporty sedan, German make, for cash. And then in no time, that German make, because also that particular model was sought after, they just couldn't bring enough to South Africa to feed the need for this car. So the value, it was one of those cases where the value, once you have the car, you can actually even charge more for it because the enthusiasts don't mind paying.
Okay.
So it ended up on one of these websites where you can sell cars, and then the price had gone up. For some reason, this particular company this time picked up on it, and they immediately realized that this is laundering, and I suppose partly because also now these names had been out in the public domain. And I remember getting a call from a person in a dealership basically saying that we've now been instructed that any cash sales of all our vehicles must go up to the highest levels from a risk perspective. So people must be able to tell us the source of the funds and all of that. They must show us paperwork to show where this money comes from. And I mean, they did this very quietly. There was no campaign. But I think it got to a point where they just could see that going forward, there's going to be a risk
Yeah.
to our reputation.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? This is something that it then brought out. Andre Director, at the time he was at ESCOM, also spoke about how in Pumalanga, particularly, car dealerships are now used to launder money.
Mm.
And the whole thing is that the car becomes yours, but it never leaves the dealership's um, registration up until such a time that there's someone who's actually interested in this car. And then once that sale goes through, the money then filters to you. And now you have legitimate funds that you can actually use to pursue whatever it is that you want to pursue.
Some of these people, when you think about what they've done, you just wonder what that mind, if it had been used positively, what it could do for the country.
Yeah.
nothing can be taken at face value ever. And crime may pay some for a little while, but ultimately it doesn't. Thank you so much for the work, the incredible work that you and many of your colleagues do. We really do appreciate it as South Africans and as journalists.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.